Good evening to you all, and thank you for joining us. My name is Ben Jenkins. I am the archivist for the Verne Historical Society, which means that I take care of some of our old historical documentation, stuff like newspapers, photographs, and what have you. I also work at the University of Laverne, where I am assistant professor of history and archivist there too. So I teach history classes and take care of our documentary heritage going back to about the 1890s. And I have been asked to speak tonight on behalf of the Historical Society and to share some of my research, which calling tonight's presentation Octopus's Garden: Railroads, Citrus Agriculture, and the Economic Transformation of Southern California. And why I have stolen the title of one of Ringo Starr's most beloved songs, I promise you, will become readily apparent by the end of the evening. Basically, this presentation will be focusing on the role of the citrus industry and railroads in the growth of Southern California, particularly going from about 1870 to 1950. This all stems out of research that I've been undertaking for the last 10 years or so that's going to be published in a book under the same name. Anyways, citrus agriculture and railroads here in Southern California may seem outwardly unrelated, but as I'm hoping to show you guys tonight, these two sectors of the economy interacted in a variety of complex ways that influenced the economy, culture, and society in Southern California during the period that I mentioned before, which is again about 1870 to 1950. 80 years is a long time, so I'm going to limit my talk here to about 3 different themes over that longue durée. First, I will explain the economic impact of railroading and citrus agriculture on SoCal. From there, I will move into how orange growers and railroad capitalists cooperated to bend and reshape the landscape of our region to their will. And finally, I will close with an exploration of how the railroad promoted the citrus industry to potential settlers and consumers across the country. That is, how it was advertised. Once all that is out of the way, we will discuss and consider how memories of citrus and railroads linger in the Golden State to this day, even within the fair city of Laverne itself. There is my cursor. There we go. So before we dive too far into things, I'd like to set out some geographical and historical context about what I mean when I use this phrase, Southern California. What is this Octopus's Garden? Many historians and geographers use the term Southern California to refer to the corner of the state from about Santa Barbara down to San Diego counties, particularly focusing on the coast. Because that definition favors coastal communities, I'm going to broaden what I understand as Southern California to also include some inland areas, such as Kern or San Bernardino and Riverside, as well as Imperial and San Luis Obispo counties. To varying extents, all of these counties, which are pictured here on this map, practiced some form of citrus agriculture up until at least the 1950s. And some of them, particularly Kern, still farm citrus today. This entire region has the perfect weather for growing citrus fruits. Southern California sits at about 34 degrees north latitude. And because of that distance from the equator, it has what geographers refer to as a Mediterranean climate, just like you'd see in Italy or in Greece. That means that the summers here are usually longer and drier, and the winters are usually wet and short, which is the inverse of many other areas of the globe. Our rainfall, as I'm sure I don't need to explain to all of you Southern Californians, all you Lavernians, usually only lasts from about October to March, which makes it necessary for irrigation, for us to take water from rivers such as the Colorado or from our mountain sources. The coastal mountain ranges generally shield Southern California from colds and storms that brew up in the northern Pacific that start off in Alaska and then barrel down the coast toward us. So because of those coastal mountain ranges, Southern California is pretty much year-round very warm, about 70 degrees. This makes Southern California really the ideal region for growing citrus fruits, which are, like me, notoriously finicky in colder environments. So you couldn't grow an orange in Texas today. Now, although Southern California is perfectly located for citrus agriculture, really during the Spanish period, when sort of California's history began, at least its recorded history, there was very little orange growing or lemon growing going on back in the mission periods, in the Spanish or in the Mexican era. Historical documents from archives going all the way back to the missions, such as San Gabriel, show that some of the missions, particularly San Gabriel and San Fernando, did grow oranges in the early part of the 19th century. But really, Spanish California, and shortly thereafterwards, Mexican California, when the nation, or excuse me, when the state was part of the Mexican Republic, was dominated by the hide and tallow trade. That is, the use of cattle to supply hides. That was the main driver of the economy. Southern California was really broken up into immense ranches where we can see scenes such as the ones from Southern California history appearing on the bottom of this slide. So cowhides were really the dominant economic force in Southern California for much of the 19th century. And they were popular across the world. Cattle hides from California went out to China. They were shipped from ports like San Diego to faraway destinations such as New England. But for the most part, Southern California, under the Mexican or under the Spanish flag, was isolated and distant from the outside world. And to make matters worse, in the 1860s, Southern California experienced a series of devastating droughts that wiped out millions of heads of cattle. I read one newspaper account from the 1860s that discussed how cattle were literally just dying in the hills around Los Angeles, and it really freaked people out to see these dead bovines. It was a harrowing in the extreme sight to one of the early Los Angeles newspapers. So that unfortunately sealed the demise of the ranchos as the commercially dominant force of California, and paved the way for the citrus industry, for the coming of millions of orange and lemon trees to Southern California. Also by this time, California had become the Golden State. That is, after the Mexican-American War, it was ceded by the Mexican Republic to the United States, becoming our 31st state. Southern California's economy really started to take off, to overcome the devastation of these droughts in the 1870s. By 1869, just before the decade began, Americans completed the first Transcontinental Railroad, that is, a train service that went all the way across the North American continent. The Transcontinental Railroad was subsidized by the federal government, and it linked the city of Omaha, Nebraska to Sacramento, California. We can see the original line in this map from the 19th century, the Overland Railroad. And we're particularly interested with the western half here, where I'm circling my mouse around, the Central Pacific Railroad, which linked about Utah to Southern California, or to Central California initially.
I did that one.
One of the two corporations that built this railroad, the Central Pacific, was actually based here in the Golden State. And it was led by four executives, four rich capitalists who had funded the railroad. Charles Crocker, who was a construction company owner, later went on to open an art museum in Sacramento. Leland Stanford, who was a president of the railroad company, and later the governor of California, our first Republican governor, probably most famous today for opening up a university after his son, who died too young. Mark Hopkins, who was a financier, a money man. And lastly, Collis P. Huntington, a lobbyist and political wheeler-dealer. Collectively, contemporaries referred to these four gentlemen as the associates, or the Big Four. Their railroad linked the Central Valley of California to the east, which allowed people here in the state, particularly farmers, to sell their goods, to sell stuff like wheat, which was grown in the Central Valley in huge quantities, to markets like Chicago or New York. So this really marked the beginning of goods being grown in California and being shipped all over the world for people to eat. Something that'll become very important in the distribution of oranges later on. Eventually, the Big Four turned their attention to Southern California. After they suffered a few financial setbacks, such as having to suffer through the Panic of 1873, a big nationwide economic contraction, they acquired or bought up a new company called the Southern Pacific Railroad, which they used to build tracks down to Los Angeles. Before the railroad got to LA, it really was just a pokey little cow town of a few thousand people where cattle were dying in the hills and it really didn't have much to offer the world. But as we'll see for the rest of our night together, the railroad dramatically reversed California's fortunes. There it is, the octopus. I promised you guys it would make sense. Despite the benefits that the railroad offered to the Golden State, namely facilitating a population increase and allowing for the shipment of California goods to various markets, the railroad actually had a very poor reputation among California's high society by the 1870s. Newspapers blasted the Southern Pacific Railroad, calling it a monopoly, saying that because it had no competition, it was able to charge high rates for freight and passenger travel. Just like Edison is charging us an arm and a leg for power today because they have no competition. Many newspapers scornfully referred to the railroad as the octopus, which suffocated the people of California, as shown in this political cartoon, with its tendrils writhing around different segments of the state. If we take a close look at this slide here, we can see the railroad as an octopus is strangling the ship here, as if to say it's killing off the shipping industry. If you want to transport your goods, you have to do it by rail now. Here's some miners, some prospectors, gentleman with a rake, clearly meant to be a farmer. Even a stagecoach, maybe a Wells Fargo stagecoach, being sopped up by this octopus. There were really countless newspaper cartoons from the late 19th century that vilified the railroad, that called it an octopus. This one is just the best known, published by the great political pundit George Keller in the satire magazine called The Wasp. So California clearly has an octopus or railroad problem in the late 19th century. It's not behaving as a good corporate citizen would in the 21st century. And in fact, the people of California took action to try to limit the railroad's ability to exercise its power and to control our economy. In 1879, the people of California sent delegates to our second constitutional convention to write a new governing document for our state. And under this new constitution, they chartered a body called the Railroad Commission, or the State Railroad Commission, to try to bring the railroad under control. But ironically, the Big Four, the associates who owned the railroad, just bribed the people who were appointed to this government committee, and they turned the Railroad Commission into an agency that essentially offered free publicization to the railroad, ironically. I think the creation of the city of Colton really best illustrates the avarice of which the railroad was capable. In the 1870s, a tiny little Mormon settlement referred to as San Bernardino, out in the San Bernardino Valley, was clamoring for a railroad connection, saying, hey, we're close to LA, build a railroad line to us. We want to help make money. We want people to come live here. We want to benefit the way railroads benefit all communities where they come. So the people of San Bernardino wanted the Big Four to lay railroad tracks to their city. And the Big Four said, sure, yeah, we'll do that in exchange for a little scratching of our backs. That is, we expect you to pay a bribe of a few $1,000s for us to build the railroad. And the people of Colton said, no, that's ridiculous. Well, you'll make back your money with all the passenger and freight traffic that you're able to charge by sending people into this city. San Bernardino refused to pay the bribe. And so the Big Four said, fine, we're not going to give you a railroad. We're literally going to start our own town next door and call it Colton, and we will put a big railroad station there just to spite you. One of my colleagues referred to this Colton as a spite town. This promotional image of Colton from back in the 19th century shows how it would have appeared decades ago in about the 1880s when the Southern Pacific Railroad came to town, which is a far cry from how it appears today with some of the biggest rail yards in California. So we have an octopus. Now let's see what role it played in planting the gardens of oranges and lemons that have become so synonymous with California. The arrival of citrus agriculture, or as I'll call it for short sometimes, citriculture, here in our corner of the Golden State, was far less controversial than the coming of the railroad. First, a little bit of history about oranges and lemons. They are not native to North America. Citrus fruits originally come from Southeast Asia. They were first brought to North America by Spanish and Portuguese conquerors who came to North and South America, what was called the New World, during the age of exploration, which was kicked off after Columbus's voyages in the 1490s. Spanish friars, that is, Catholic priests who started the mission system here in California, when they first settled our state, brought orange trees to missions, particularly to Mission San Gabriel. So the first oranges came with the missionaries. Later on, during the Mexican period, just outside the city of Los Angeles, outside what we think of as downtown LA today, an American fur trapper who'd settled in Southern California to rest his weary old bones in a warm climate, a gentleman by the name of William Wolfskill, established an orange grove at Los Angeles in 1841, which was, up until that time, the largest citrus plantation in North America. But the citrus industry in California really achieved true prominence with the arrival of the Bahia variety of orange, which is more famously known to us in Southern California as the Washington navel orange, or the navel orange, if you prefer. I'm seeing some head nodding. I'm seeing some people saying, oh yeah, we know about that. Well, remember, as I said, the Portuguese brought the oranges to the New World, and they brought them in particular to Brazil, which makes good sense. It's a very...
Battery booster for the cell phone.
It's out of power.
Sorry about that. Gonna mute someone over there. Anyways, Brazil is known for being subtropical, so it's a really good place to grow oranges. And so because of that, the Portuguese grew oranges there very early on. And for whatever reason, maybe it was the climate, maybe it was the tropical diseases that live there, the oranges in Brazil started to mutate, and they became this seedless variety. The seedless oranges mutated and appeared outside the city of Bahia, Brazil. And because they don't actually have any seeds inside them, typically a navel orange actually has a little protrusion inside where there's a second fruit, the little embryo of something else.
Oh, yeah.
And that makes usually the orange kind of puff out at one end, like a distended belly button, hence navel. If you look closely at the end of some of the oranges in this image, you can see there it is. There's a little belly button. There's the navel in navel orange. So oranges starting to mutate in Brazil. By the early 1870s, some of these trees had come to the US Department of Agriculture. They'd come to Washington, D.C., where a USDA agent gave them to two of his buddies, his friends, who were traveling to Southern California. These were a man and a woman by the name of Eliza and Luther Tibbets. I could go on about them forever. They were transcendentalists. They tried to form free integrated communities of Black and white people in Virginia after the Civil War, which got them into a lot of trouble with the locals. They also tried to commune with the dead through Ouija boards repeatedly. Just really fascinating characters. But for our purposes, this is important because they took these oranges on the road with them to California. After they got chased out of Virginia, trying to make a racially integrated commune, they decided, screw this, we're going to the West Coast. We're gonna, just like William Wolfskill, try to rest our weary old bones in a warm environment, maybe help deal with some of our arthritis. And in particular, they settled at a little new town called Riverside that was right on the banks of the Santa Ana River, just south of San Bernardino. And they decided that they were going to try to grow oranges. They were going to turn this town into the orange growing center of California. Early on, Riverside was not a wealthy town. They did not have enough money for irrigation canals. And so very famously, Eliza, when she needed to water her orange trees, would just do the dishes, and then she'd use that dirty dishwater when she was done with it to nourish her saplings. That's dedication. I should also explain that the image that we can see in this slide is what we would refer to as a citrus crate label, which would have been plastered to the side of a
Look at
wooden
this
orange
stuff.
crate and shipped out across the continent. This is a very commonly used advertising image within the industry.
Oh, right, this is it.
And again, note that the orange is referred to as seedless here, that it doesn't have any seeds inside. So you don't have to worry about choking hazards. You don't have to worry about spitting them out. Plus, for my money, navel oranges just taste better. So we have oranges. And from there, it's a short leap to establishing enormous gardens that blanketed entire cities, like we can see in this image of Riverside around 1900. The Washington navel orange precipitated an agricultural phenomenon that, when combined with the real estate boom that the railroad started here in Southern California, transformed our regional economy. In particular, a gentleman by the name of Ebenezer G. Brown, who was one of the first settlers in the city of Riverside and a tireless advertiser or booster of that city throughout the 1870s, decided to plant his own grove of orange trees in Riverside. His idea caught the attention of other growers, and before long, really the entire town was covered on this massive scale of acres upon acres of citrus fruits, particularly the navel orange. Many pioneers went right up to Eliza Tibbets's house and asked for clippings. That is, took their own shears, would clip off a branch of one of her orange trees and would plant that as a way to get orange trees of their own. So the Washington navel orange is very much the dominant crop in Riverside. Even as late as World War II, in 1945, one pamphlet from the Riverside County Chamber of Commerce placed the total annual revenue of the orange industry at $15.5 million. Oranges made more money than any other crop that was grown in California. A grapefruit, for instance, came in a very distant second place at $3.5 million or so. One pamphlet produced in 1934 for an orange company bragged that, quote, "The orange represents California's greatest fruit industry, which has brought more wealth to our state than all of the gold mined in California since 1848, end quote. That's a dubious claim. Its veracity is quite questionable. But still, what is not questionable is the fact that orange groves extended from Riverside out to Rialto, to places like Ontario, Pomona, all across the San Bernardino Valley, and into our San Gabriel Valley, into places like Laverne by the end of the 19th century. Although this image looks quite verdure, quite orange, or quite green, I should say, those are actually orange trees for the most part. You have a few what look like eucalypti and oaks growing in, acting as windbreaks within the groves, but really those are all meant to grow navel orange trees. Riverside was just the first. Many numbers of towns across California started to grow oranges far and wide across our state. And thanks to the railroad, those oranges could be shipped to markets all over the country. As early as 1877, an orange grower in LA by the name of Joseph Wolfscale, whose father William had been a citrus baron back in the 1840s, shipped an entire car of oranges over the Southern Pacific Railroad lines to St. Louis, Missouri, which was like the midpoint of the continent back in the day. This woodcut illustration shows what rural Los Angeles looked like in 1880s. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this is downtown LA, not that far from where Union Station is today. And as you might be able to guess, all those trees that we can see popping up in the middle of this image, those are orange trees. This shipping of oranges to Missouri in 1877 was a big deal for publicists here in California. It brought national attention to orange production in the Southland. Joseph Wolfscale had to spend about $500 on shipping these oranges, and he met personally with the railroad heads to make sure that the oranges would be properly preserved, would be iced periodically as they rolled across the continent in icing stations in Arizona and Kansas. The Southern Pacific Railroad, that Octopus that we talked about just a few minutes ago, even opened its terminal here in LA, the famous Arcade Depot, on the Wolfscale property, very close to where it could ship the oranges. So people who were brought into Los Angeles were given sight of this beautiful grove as they arrived in the city. This also opened the door for railroads and for citrus growers to cooperate here in California, working together to form a mutually beneficial relationship. These groves, serviced by the railroad, truly had become an octopus's garden by the 1880s. Following the example set by Riverside, countless cities across Southern California devoted themselves to citrus agriculture. And in many cases, these towns were right along the main line of the railroads. Communities in Orange County or the San Gabriel Valley, which appears in this image taken around 1900, prospered growing oranges and lemons. According to one botanist, a gentleman by the name of Thomas Gary, who wrote in about 1880, quote, "The oranges of Los Angeles cannot compare in point of excellence with those of the San Gabriel fruit belts and other favored localities," end quote. Translation, Laverne orange growers do it better, or grow better fruit, if you will. This image actually came from a railroad publication. This was circulated by a railroad company and gives us a good sense of the fact that the Southern Pacific Railroad was an equal partner in selling the dream of an orange paradise to the people of California. Well, there comes a time when even the octopus must die, or must at least face economic competition from a competitor. Monopolies don't last forever. And in particular, in the 1880s, the Southern Pacific Railroad's monopoly on transportation fell apart as it was challenged by a new railroad company, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, which came from Kansas, as the name implies, Atchison, Topeka, for instance, across New Mexico, hence Santa Fe, then through Arizona into California. And in fact, the Santa Fe Railroad, as it's often called for short, cooperated very closely with orange growers in the state to break the Southern Pacific's grasp on Southern California. By 1885, the Santa Fe Railroad had built a line all the way from the state border with Arizona into Los Angeles, which allowed people living in places like San Bernardino or Laverne or Claremont, or even Los Angeles, to ship their goods and to bring passengers to their cities without having to rely on the octopus. It's classic capitalism. Competition will save us all, will lower prices, will save us from big businesses. And in particular, the orange growing centers of National City and San Bernardino became major railroad terminals, were very important in bringing the Santa Fe to California. Crucial way stations that linked what's called the Orange Empire of Southern California to the Midwest, where the Santa Fe came from. Californians across this nascent Orange Empire, from San Bernardino down to San Diego, from Santa Barbara on the coast to inland Redlands, rejoiced that they now had a means to ship their products across the continent that did not involve the dreaded Southern Pacific. One newspaper published in the town of Redlands, which is just east of San Bernardino, observed that the Santa Fe, which ran from the Gulf of Mexico to the Midwest, had, quote, a vast domain over which to exercise power and influence. But the vast responsibility which is imposed rests with just and liberal-minded men, to whom the rights and interests of the public, as well as their stockholders, are subjects of conscientious consideration, end quote. The image on this slide shows a passenger train steaming along the railroad tracks of the Santa Fe Railroad in my hometown, Laverne. This image actually comes from our university archives. And as we can kind of get a sense of from the trees here in the foreground, if we look a little close, we see these darker circular orbs here. What do you think those are? Oranges, of course. These are orange trees, which you can see just about everywhere in early Lordsburg or Laverne. The most important connection between railroads and orange growers was economic. Railroads laid the foundation for citrus agriculture to become profitable. And so corporate symbiosis developed between railroad networks and the rapidly expanding citrus communities of Southern California. In 1900, a writer commented about the city of Riverside that, quote, both of California's great railroad systems, the Southern Pacific and the Santa Fe, reach Riverside and have contributed not a little to the upbuilding of the community, end quote. Even before Riverside was ever connected to the railroad, it had played a leading role in the development of California's citrus industry. But combined with railroads that linked it to ports in Los Angeles and San Diego that provided with direct connections to the eastern United States, the economic impact was compounded, and Riverside's importance really solidified oranges as the major commercial crop. A botanist who published for the California Department of Agriculture a book on citrus, or on agriculture of all the kinds of fruits that were grown here, commented that, quote, in California, the orange is king, end quote. Not too different from cotton being king in the South, but let's ignore the connotations there for just a few minutes. By 1890, Riverside was the richest city in the US per capita. That is, on average, the people there were richer than any other place in the US because of oranges. Washington navel oranges from Riverside were transported all the way to the Atlantic coast of the US. From its river station in the city of Los Angeles, the Southern Pacific Railroad sent the first train, called its Special Orange Train, east in 1886 to capitalize on the increasing clamor among eastern states for oranges that were grown in Southern California, as opposed to oranges grown in Florida, which were seen as inferior. Didn't taste as good. Those are for juicing, not for eating. For what it's worth, California also invented orange juice, so Florida can't even get that right. By the harvest of 1890, growers had sent about 2,000 train cars east from Los Angeles over the Rocky Mountains by rail, by these special orange trains. Railroads also capitalized on orange groves as a tourist attraction. Both of our major rail lines, that Southern Pacific, the Octopus, and the Santa Fe, ran trains through the orange groves and let people raise their windows to smell the citrus breeze, a la Disney California Adventures Soarin' Over California attraction, which very famously blasted orange scents into the nostrils of its riders. This postcard depicts some alluring oranges beckoning passersby. The connection between Southern California's young citrus industry and its emerging transportation networks was just as beneficial for the railroad as well. As early as 1889, one of the big four, one of those capitalists who helped fund the railroad, perceived that, quote, great development is coming to Southern California. And sure enough, by the early 20th century, the Southland had about 107 railroad stations, 60% of them located in rural backcountry areas that were known for citrus agriculture. They're not all in LA or San Bernardino. Railroads promoted resettlement in citrus districts through lush illustrations, such as the advertisement that I've included in this image. If you didn't see the words Southern Pacific at the bottom, you probably wouldn't know that this was a railroad ad. By 1939, citrus traffic coming from Southern California being shipped by rail was so voluminous that 6 out of every 50 trains transported just oranges and lemons. So as Europe is going to war, California is still growing Washington navel oranges. All right, that's enough on commerce. Let's turn to publicization and advertisement in a little more detail now. Starting with the first Orange Fair in Riverside, which was held in 1879 and where Eliza Tibbets had her oranges win the top honors. Exhibitions of produce from the Golden State became a crucial marketing tactic to attract national attention to our goods. San Diego had its first citrus fair in National City in 1882. Fruits cultivated in Riverside and neighboring regions made their way to distant cities such as Louisville, Kentucky, New Orleans, Crescent City, and Chicago in Illinois. The railroad frequently sponsored these citrus exhibits and transported them from place to place free of charge. By far, one of the splashiest California orange displays was in Chicago at what was called the World's Colombian Exposition. This was a massive World's Fair held in 1893 in Chicago to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's expeditions to the Western Hemisphere. Californians at this World's Fair organized a massive display in the horticultural building. They used oranges to build this giant tower with a bald eagle at the top, labeled as the Monument of the Oranges in this image from 1893. Excuse me. What did the trains carry when they came back from the east? Really nothing. They were empty. They're here to basically fill up with more oranges and go make another journey. The Santa Fe and the Southern Pacific Railroads invested significantly in the promotion of citrus agriculture through advertisements and fairs. They promoted orange shows across the United States with the goal of increasing citrus freight and carrying more settlers to Southern California. In 1886, for example, the Southern Pacific Railroad made much of its efforts to establish a citrus fair at Chicago, which gave oranges from the Golden State their first major venue to transfix national audiences. 2 years later, in 1888, the railroad started its California on Wheels campaign, a traveling exhibit that was designed to market goods from our state, particularly oranges, in target regions like Iowa within the Midwest. The Los Angeles Times credited the railroad's efforts and these popular exhibitions with helping Southern California, quote, wrest from Florida the citrus scepter, end quote. So California is now the king of oranges, not Florida. In the ensuing decades, the railroads facilitated more exhibitions at Chicago, even one in Paris in 1900. The images on this slide show us some specimens at the National Orange Show, which was held in San Bernardino starting in 1911. The Santa Fe Railroad regularly participated in displays at this show, and we can actually see a railroad locomotive made out of oranges in the top here. And if you look very closely, you can see the rain cross of the Santa Fe logo in the window here. I want to share more trivia about all this stuff, but I only have so much time. So we'll come back later if we have more time during the Q&A. Sometimes railroaders and the citrus industry cooperated, and sometimes they clashed. Many of their fights revolved around the high rates that railroads charged to shippers. As late as 1926, one government official complained that, quote, in the citrus industry, at the present time, the element of cost of transportation of the total paid by the consumer is in excess of 20%, which could menace the very existence of the industry, end quote. Charles Teague, a prominent citrus agriculturalist based in Santa Paula in Ventura County who grew lemons, whose packing house appears on the image on the slide, summed up the problems that many orange growers in California faced well into the 20th century. According to Teague, quote, in the year 1936, there originated in California for railroad haul 370,000 cars of agricultural products. Most of these moved under refrigeration into interstate commerce, an average haul of approximately 2,200 miles. Freight costs already high, the total transportation bill of this tonnage aggregated over $100 million, which is a kingly sum for the 1930s. Adjusted for inflation, it would be in the billions, not even counting the cost of refrigeration. To combat these high freight rates, orange growers started to organize. As early as 1887, a settler in the Pasadena area by the name of James DeBarth Shorb led what was called the Orange Growers Protective Association of Southern California, OGPASC. That's an unsightly acronym. It's no wonder that this fell apart after just a few years. But at the very least, it did set a precedent that orange growers could come together. They could pool their resources to handle the high rates that the railroads charged. Pooling, the idea of orange growers cooperating, working together, manifested most visibly in the creation of what were called packing houses, where 3 or 4 orange growers in any given town would come together to jointly pack and ship oranges by rail to eastern markets, pooling their resources, working together, cooperating. The packing house that we see in this image was the first to appear in Santa Paula, California. Notice that it's right on the railroad tracks. I said many of these early citrus towns literally built right on the tracks. That was on purpose, for commercial reasons. They prospered next to the railroad. The idea of cooperative associations among orange growers reappeared in about the 1890s when another economic panic struck the US and there was a depression. Citrus growers across Southern California had begun to discuss forming an organization to protect their economic and political interests. They blamed middlemen who shipped and handled crops for minimizing the profits that came back to California. After a number of growers in communities such as Riverside and Claremont organized what they called regional fruit exchanges or regional cooperative associations, they banded together to form what was called the Southern California Fruit Exchange. That organization later changed its name, was redubbed the California Fruit Growers Exchange to be more inclusive of people across the state. And it very quickly took control of the citrus industry in California through its brand, which was Sunkissed. I'm sure we've all heard that name today, or many of us have eaten Sunkissed products. Almost overnight, Sunkissed became synonymous with California oranges. According to Charles Teague, who was the president of the Sunkissed Corporation for many years, the California Fruit Growers Exchange is the largest of our cooperative grower marketing organizations and is famous throughout the world as a model of what can be done by farmers in cooperative marketing. End quote. Quote. According to one of its advertisements, the exchange, Sunkissed, prided itself, I'm getting ahead of myself, on providing accurate market information to its members and offering cheap marketing and low supply costs. One of its most important goals was to secure fair treatment from the exploitative railroads. The Sunkissed organization had a strict hierarchy that benefited its growers. At the local level, growers would come together, maybe 4 or 5 of them, to form a packing house association to pack their fruits into boxes before putting them onto railroad freight cars. To join, according to the California Fruit Growers Exchange, quote, growers were expected to sign a contract to turn over all their crops to the association within the time frame specified by contract. The grower would then receive standardized compensation for oranges, which is set by the local board of directors, end quote. So locally controlled. On the next echelon, one level up the corporate ladder, regionally, packing houses joined together to form a district exchange, which usually served between 1 and 20 packing houses. And the board of directors of a district exchange consisted of members from across the local associations. Again, local control. At the very top was the general exchange, presided over by its own president. Within a few years of Sunkissed coming together, it flexed its political muscle. It started its own legal arm called the Citrus Protective League, where it sued and won a number of cases against the Southern Pacific Railroad that made it all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States by 1914, which prevented the railroad from overexploiting by charging huge freight rates. Something to be said for organization. Railroads and citrus growers also reshaped the landscape of Southern California to fit their commercial desires. The railroad owned a huge amount of land across the American West, specifically here in Southern California, that it used to enrich itself. Before the first Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, as an enticement to get railroad companies to build across the West, the US federal government actually granted millions of acres of land to private railroad companies, which those companies could develop and sell at a profit as they saw fit to run their operations. Land grants from the federal government of the United States to the Central Pacific Railroad totaled about 12 million acres of land, an area that is larger in size than the state of Maryland. During the 1870s, Congress granted the Southern Pacific Railroad rights of way and control of adjacent land over huge swaths of territory in San Bernardino County, which appears in this map. The green portions signify areas that are owned by the railroad, huge chunks of land that the railroad can develop, sell off, make money off of. Although historians have different opinions about the exact amount of land that the railroad owned in the Western US, at its peak, the Southern Pacific Railroad, the Octopus, owned somewhere between 8 and 12 million acres. As late as 1919, we know for a fact that the railroad still owned here in California 2,600,000 acres, just in the southern part of the state. And the railroad used this land as a commercial asset to influence the development of Southern California. Railroads worked overtime to entice farmers to purchase land that they owned so that they could produce crops excuse me, such as oranges and lemons, which would then get shipped by the railroad, and so everyone would make money in the long run. When they had land, orange growers suburbanized the landscape, building new cities right along the railroad tracks to produce and transport oranges. In 1887, at the height of what was called the Rate War between the Southern Pacific and Santa Fe Railroad, when they were trying to undercut prices on each other to get people to move to California, 13 new towns came into existence along the Santa Fe Railroad line, just from San Bernardino to Los Angeles, just in this small area of the map. 13 new towns, 1 year. The denizens of these new towns, particularly newspapermen, were extremely grateful to the railroad for all that they did in settling Southern California. So the Octopus is what's brought people here, and it really encouraged people to use the land to grow oranges. Some of you eagle-eyed fans might also notice a discrepancy in this map. Lordsburg appears here. That's what Laverne was called at one point, or at least a segment of what is today the city of Laverne, used to be called Lordsburg. And it's actually listed as being east of Claremont on this map. That's just a typo. Nobody picked Lordsburg up and transported it west of Claremont one night. The map makers, the cartographers, simply got the story wrong here. By the late 19th century, these two railroads, our Southern Pacific Octopus and the Santa Fe, were scrambling to outbuild each other to reach the orange growing communities of Southern California. This excellent map, which comes from a great book on oranges in California called Trees in Paradise by Jared Farmer, shows the railroad lines that ran through Southern California from about 1900. One railroad executive wrote during this period, quote, "I thought that our interests coincided with those of the fruit growers in having the Eastern markets take all the fruit they will absorb at paying prices," end quote. So the railroad very much marketing orange and lemon growing as a way to make money, that they're getting rich off of it too. So the oranges are building along the railroad tracks, but in turn, the railroad is trying to get to these citrus communities across Southern California. True symbiosis, two sectors of the economy working together. By the turn of the 20th century, the citrus industry in California was also becoming mechanized, that is, heavily dependent on heavy industry, which modified the human relationship to the land. And in particular, we can look inside the packing houses of the citrus industry to see how heavily industrialized they were. Before 1900, most California packing houses didn't use machinery. They mainly relied on human hands, on human bodies to complete the work. But by the 20th century, they were starting to plug into General Electric Company or Southern California Edison. And these packing houses were able to use electrical fruit washers, conveyor belts, sizers, sorters, dryers, all kinds of heavy machinery. They bought oil from Standard Oil Company to burn fossil fuels. To nourish their trees, they purchased fertilizer from businesses like the Pacific Ammonia and Chemical Company. Many of these packing houses even had telephones. They plugged into what was called the Pacific Telephone and Telegraph Company's network. Beyond chemicals and small manufactured goods, orange and lemon packers made use of heavy machinery to maximize their productivity. And an entire industry developed around providing supplies to California's packing houses. In Riverside, two dueling machinists competed for supremacy in this endeavor. George Parker and his Parker Machine Works battled against the California Iron Works Company owned by Fred Stiebler. And really, these two guys built machinery that handled every step of the orange production process, helped prepare the ground for trees to be planted, helped harvest the fruit, and then cleaned it and prepared it for shipping. So all the way from the groves to the packing houses to the railroad cars. Together, Stiebler and Parker, who hated each other, and makes it much more ironic that they eventually had to merge, sold orange box makers, crate litters, fruit dryers, all kinds of strange machines that were used to industrialize packing houses. We can get a sense of some of the heavy machinery that appeared in packing houses in this image here. Also, just in time for International Women's Day, notice that women were a major part of the citrus industry in California, sometimes as landowners, sometimes working in packing houses. The railroad also changed how it industrialized to meet the needs of orange and lemon growers. In its particular, the Santa Fe and Southern Pacific railroads invested in the creation of ventilated and refrigerated cars, which were called reefers for short. Reefer means something very different today, but we won't get into that. The first refrigerator cars, or reefers, which were used to preserve goods as they went by rail to the eastern United States, appeared in 1887. And as time went on and technology improved, better refrigerator cars allowed oranges to travel further and further from the Golden State. By 1900, the Santa Fe's refrigerator dispatch, that's right, they spelled it with an E, had over 1,000 iced refrigerator cars and 538 ventilated cars. Not to be outdone, the Southern Pacific Railroad cooperated with another company, the Union Pacific, and together they formed what was called the Pacific Fruit Express. What is it with these guys in Pacific, I swear? The famed yellow refrigerator cars that the Pacific Fruit Express ran numbered about 6,000. Railroads opened up ice plants in places such as Los Angeles, Colton, and other cities in the Citrus Belt to chill oranges as they rolled east across the continent. So thanks to the incorporation of technology that developed at the birthplace of the Orange Empire, citrus packing became firmly ensconced as an industrial activity by the early 20th century. So the long and short of it is that the railroads and the citrus industry worked together and changed the way that people interacted with the physical world of California, where they built their homes, their communities, their packing houses. Really important in the process of making California what it is today. Well, folks, all good things, including this presentation, must come to an end. The Octopus's garden began to decline in the 1940s. In that decade, thanks largely to World War II, industrial manufacturing, building battleships and aircraft to win the war against Japan, started to displace citrus growing as the dominant commercial activity in Southern California. As more people came to work in the factories of California, trees were torn down to make way for suburban tract housing. So oranges and lemons being removed to make way for settlers living here. In the 10 years from 1945 to 1955, just in one single decade, the amount of land devoted to the cultivation of citrus in Los Angeles and Orange counties declined by 43,000 acres. Automobiles had become affordable and started to replace railroads as the dominant form of travel. Californians, and really Americans across the West, demanded that the government subsidize the construction of highways as a public good. The resultant construction of what we call freeways today also sealed the fate of the Orange Empire of Southern California, trees having to be uprooted to make way for our new road system. Our impressive freeway network, which really is a model for the rest of the country, appears in the image in this slide. Subdivisions or towns that were created in the Southland around the turn of the 20th century to grow oranges and lemons removed their crops to make way for new highways. In Orange County, named because of its connection to our citrus industry, groves receded as the Santa Ana Freeway, or the 57, connected the city of that name up to the San Gabriel Valley in the north. In 1996, the railroad was no longer making as much money in California. The Southern Pacific, that formerly dreaded Octopus, once the most powerful monopoly in the state, was actually bought out by a rival business, the Union Pacific Railroad. So by the mid-1990s, the Octopus and the Garden are pretty much kaputskis. Be willing to bet at least some of you folks recognize this magic kingdom in this image on this slide. Even though the Octopus's garden disappeared, the railroads and the orange groves are gone. They still exercise an enduring grip on the popular conception of what Southern California is. After World War II, in the late 40s and in the early 1950s, a famed movie executive, Walter Elias Disney, better known as Walt Disney, invested in the creation of an amusement park that he eventually dubbed Disneyland. To realize his dream, Disney bought a huge tract of land in Anaheim, California, where there were 4,000 Valencia orange trees that were bearing fruit at the time that he bought it. Walt had these trees torn down. Legend says he wanted to save a handful of them, but for whatever reason, his instructions got lost. So the oranges were bulldozed to make way for his idealized version of America. Opened in 1955, Disneyland, which appears on this slide on opening day, paid homage to one of Disney's greatest obsessions, railroads. A small passenger line bounded the former citrus groves of Disney's park in Anaheim, the last new major railroad to be formed in old Orange Country. When Disneyland opened up, the Santa Fe Railroad, so critical to the success of the citrus industry, actually donated about $50,000 to start Disney's railroad. Just because we don't have an Octopus's garden anymore doesn't mean that the railroads and the orange groves aren't historically important to California. In fact, we have a number of museums, outdoor art projects, and all kinds of other various arts venues that promote this idealized version of California's landscape. I've included just a few on this slide, or in the next few ensuing ones. Here, we might recognize this one from the side of a building in Laverne, showing sort of a positive relationship between the community, between the town, and this history that they lived through. One of my favorite murals here in Laverne, showing the history of the citrus industry, and to a slightly less extent, the railroad, appears on the side of one of the buildings of the University of Laverne. This mural was painted in 1992, titled Scrapbook. The images that are part of this mural that lovingly bedecks the side of this building depict the original railroad depot of Laverne, back when it was called Lordsburg in the 1880s. Another image recreates an old pamphlet from the city's history, which recalls Laverne as, quote, the heart of the Orange Empire. What do we see in the foreground of this image? But the railroad tracks. These are the Santa Fe tracks, not the Metrolink tracks that were built by Southern Pacific decades ago. So the octopus garden still present in the imagination. A number of open-air museums also preserve memories about the octopus's garden. If you ever have the chance, visit the California Citrus State Historic Park in Riverside, which is a beautiful open-air museum, about 400 acres in size, which shows Riverside as it would have appeared about 100 years ago, when it was the heart of the naval orange industry. Every day, or at least every day before the pandemic, docents scoured the park's trees, removing ripe fruits to put in the visitor display center at the State Historic Park. They also have what are called tour and tastes, where visitors can literally go out into the orange groves, pick oranges, and take them home to eat, or to juice if you prefer. Notice how similar Riverside looks in these images, which were shot in about 2020, as compared to the image I showed you of Riverside earlier. Either way, it's a sort of sea of green covered in orange trees. Here's the inside of the museum, which I won't linger on since I am very much wearing out my time and my welcome here. We can also see the legacies of the citrus and railroad industries intermingling at Paris, California, which is sort of on the periphery of historical citrus country. Orange Empire Railway Museum, small sort of railroad park just along Interstates 215, in a town that was actually named for a railroad engineer. It boasts that it has, quote, the West's largest connection of streetcars, interurban cars, locomotives, passenger cars, freight cars, and cabooses, end quote. Very cool thing about these museums is that it really brings history alive. We're not just reading about the past, we're actually going to pick the orange trees. You get to ride the railroads. You can actually drive a steam locomotive at the Orange Empire Railway Museum. I want to do that someday. The Orange Empire Railway Museum has a couple connections to the citrus industry. For instance, when I visited, I went inside a car of a Pacific Electric trolley, and I saw this ad for sun-kissed lemonade, very closely connected to the citrus industry. Remember that I also mentioned what was called the Pacific Fruit Express, which was a company that made refrigerator cars to ship oranges from California across the country. They have Pacific Fruit Express cars at this museum that are refurbished. For a 100-year-old railroad car, I'd say this is looking pretty good. All right, so parting thoughts before I open the floor to questions. As this admittedly brief exploration of the historic sites of Southern California shows, local citizens have used a variety of tactics to commemorate citrus and railroad, the octopus's garden. Far from relinquishing these components of history to scrapyards or compost piles, Southern Californians have reconfigured our railroad cars and our orange trees as productive historical artifacts. Open air parks and museums rejuvenate these two sectors of the economy, complete with orange-bearing trees and functioning locomotives. Public art at commercial venues or schools like the University of Laverne and historical downtowns close to the tracks of the railroads fondly recall the octopus's garden. So even though the railroads and the citrus industry no longer exercise commercial dominance, the idea that we once had an orange empire covered with railroad tracks still retains a powerful influence over our collective memory.